many people working in the region, around the region. A lot of really renowned experts on security issues and the Black Sea. I don't think we need a big introduction, especially given the role the Black Sea has played in the news in the recent months, which had not been the case before. And maybe apart from the Crimea invasion, the Black Sea has been quiet for some time, but then it occasionally re-emerges in the news cycle. And unfortunately, every time it happens, it is security related. We seem to treat the Black Sea more as a security arena rather than an economic arena or a field of environment cooperation or a region of sorts, whatever region we may want to construct. And so I'm really grateful to our colleague Gustav Gressel, who really took the courage to write this paper, because I guess somebody without naval or Black Sea presence like Austria, Gustav being Austrian, is probably better fitted than any of us here around to ask questions about the Black Sea in a serious way. Gustav has been watching European security issues for many years now. And I think his work on Ukraine also has been quite significant in its own right. But I'm very happy that he turned southeast. So Gustav, over to you.
Thanks a lot for the kind introduction. Yeah, so Austria is very far away. I'm not the very usual Austrian, but I can assure you that at least my grand-uncle had been admiral in the Austrian-Hungarian Navy. So
that must be a big job.
Yeah, actually the Danube flotilla at the Navy had after the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, a very small Black Sea detachment, bringing some monitors down to kind of guard some Black Sea ports. There were some pictures of them toddling around in Crimea and in Odessa, but it all basically fell apart with the collapse of the Central Powers and the Russian Civil War that quickly unraveled in the area. And then the Brits came in and took over more or less. But history aside, I mean, my paper sort of, I guess, guessing from who is in the audience, I don't need to lecture anybody on what's going on in the Black Sea. It's sort of the main purpose of my paper is to refocus a bit of the attention of security folks in Europe. The problem, sort of the discussion on security in the eastern flank that unfolded after 2014 when everybody asks itself, so, okay, and what does that all mean for us? Cycled around the Suwalki Gap and the Baltic Sea and the Baltic countries, which for some time, of course, was an obvious choice. It was regarded as the most vulnerable spot of NATO. However, given the developments there, you have at least an established forward presence and sort of the proximity of quite potent allied neighbors, at least in relative terms, just make me wonder whether the Black Sea really is the weak spot of the alliance and whether you don't have other spots that aren't weaker in this. And on that, the Black Sea is under discussed. Yes, we have it hit the news, for example, when the Sea of Azov dispute erupted into the open with the capture of the Ukrainian naval vessels that tried to make it around Crimea and enter the Sea of Azov through the Kerch Strait. But once the sailors were exchanged and in a prisoner swap and the vessels were returned, basically it all disappeared from the news, despite that the issues that we have in the Black Sea and that the changing pace of militarization that is led by the military modernization in Crimea and on Crimea, and the reinforcements of military infrastructure in Crimea is still the same, and actually continues to progress as we speak, as there have been sort of a number of bases that have been modernized. We've seen an influx of troops, and even, I mean, I don't need to repeat sort of the force structure of Russia on Crimea. What strikes me is that Russia is preparing access military infrastructure there. So you see even bases that are not very well used, or not in particular high amount of use, to be rebuilt and expanded to, in crisis, host further assets, be it land forces or air forces. And more slower, but still continuing naval modernization and naval forces, so that in case of an emergency, Russia could project more military power than actually they have now troops on Crimea, and use it as a springboard to coerce other neighbors as well. And we have already seen 2 examples how this was used. This was, of course, in 2014, in March, April, when Russia used large military exercises around Ukraine to sort of threaten Kiev not to deploy major military forces. I mean, March, April, Ukraine had almost no major military forces because the state of their armed forces was quite dismal. Not to use them in the Donbass to be deployed against people who started to take over governmental buildings and local administrations and parliaments in Donetsk, Lugansk, Slaviansk, and other places, but stick them to the west and move them into defensive positions. And that facilitated, of course, what we now know as the war in the Donbass, but sort of the emergence of this war in the Donbass. And we saw a repeat exercise in April, May 2021, when again, sort of Donbass was probably the thing the Russians tried to make a point. Russia again tried to threaten Ukraine by building up forces, of course, around Ukraine, but particularly also on Crimea. And this is sort of what my paper tries to stress. If you have this kind of military superiority, if you have the assets in place to project military power, you cannot only use this in sort of in the case of a total war, or in the case of a real big, deep crisis between the alliance and Russia, or between the Americans and Russia, but you can use this in day-to-day business in the sort of still open security issues that are there in the Black Sea, to reinforce your point, to trying to coerce the other states to back down. And some of the problems I try to describe in the paper, this is of course maritime delimitation, so the delimitation of the exclusive economic zones and the respective rights to extract oil, gas, fisheries, etc. Issues of freedom of navigation, and of course particularly the access to the Sea of Azov in special. This will also be particularly relevant on a larger stage if what seems to be likely, Russia will lose the Court of Arbitration ruling in where is it, Hamburg, the Naval Court, Court of Arbitration, because then they're in a very similar position like the Chinese. They basically occupy a sea. International law in its current standing form says, no, you shouldn't, but you have the military might to ignore that. And it will sort of push them and the Chinese basically by virtue closer together. And then you have sort of potential flare-ups that might come up. Crimea is a useful tool, like a crisis in the Balkans where you try to gain access to the Central Balkan or to Serbia, and you need to coerce transit countries to grant you this transit, or a renewed crisis or a conflict with Georgia or with Ukraine, where the possession of Crimea, as described in the paper, gives you ample of military options to cut off reinforcements or cut them off from any Western help, and make a reaction to a unfolding crisis in these countries by anybody else but Russia much more difficult. Why is countering this such a problem? Which is the other thing is, first of all, you have a sort of two of the littoral states, Ukraine and Georgia, defense-wise, they are not members of NATO, and they're coping with a very difficult catch-up process, trying to modernize and de-Sovieticize their armed forces, including of course naval and air forces, but predominantly land forces because of their frozen conflict. That draws away resources which aren't plentiful anyway, and hence this transformation and de-Sovietization of the armed forces, and not only the armed forces, the whole security sector and security apparatus is unfortunately quite slow. The second thing is that even those countries who are in the alliance, Turkey, Romania, and Bulgaria, are tricky. Turkey is a separate case, with Erdogan pursuing its very own foreign policy, sometimes sort of now being in a phase where he tries to sort of with Washington and re-engages with the West, but as we've seen last week with the prospect of further Russian-Turkish defense industrial cooperation, he's wobbly on that. It's no constant, and in any crisis, the default option of Turkish foreign policy is that of ambiguous neutrality. Wait and see where the others are going, what's in there for Turkey, in there on this side or in there on that side, and depending on that, Turkey will make a decision, which leaves us to Romania and Bulgaria, who are, militarily speaking, in their own very difficult transition situation after sort of having transited from a Warsaw Pact army to a NATO expeditionary warfare, let's go to Iraq and Afghanistan type of armed forces, especially in the case of Romania, now back to Article 5 defense of the alliance, and the demand list for what you would actually need to do and need to modernize is very long, and the attention by the rest of the alliance to the modernization needs of these two states is not very high. So unlike the Baltic countries, you have not this kind of established foreign military presence. As in case of the enhanced forward presence, you have in Romania limited US military presence, occasional maneuvers. We saw the establishment of the multinational corps southeast, but it's if you compare the maneuvers and exercises they run, it's still a comparatively modest show compared to the Baltics. And this is why sort of ECFR, or I tried to shove this paper up ECFR and particularly address the European audience, because it's all, for the time being, the Americans have been the most responsive to all military modernization needs, both in peacetime as well as in crisis, in terms of deploying ships to the Black Sea if something happens, etc. The European component in taking care of security issues in the Black Sea is strikingly low, unfortunately. Although the potential to act there is still there, and much of the things I've suggested, from sort of sending on a permanent rotational basis, just like you have land forces and the Baltic naval forces into the Black Sea, it's all possible within the Montreux Convention and within current arrangements. You would just need to have the will to do so. The same applies for training and maneuvers, both with the associated countries as well as on the ground. The NATO Warsaw Founding Act bans of deploying sizable combat forces to new NATO member states, but it does not ban us from deploying combat support forces or those logistical command and control, electronic warfare, etc. assets that you, for example, need to make the multinational core Southeast a true operational theater command. So all these possibilities we have for now are horribly underused, and I try to poke my nose into what actually would be necessary and what are sort of the low-hanging fruits of things that Europeans can do to improve the situation there. And I think now I've bored you long enough. The long version, of course, is in the paper, and I'm happy to be up for your questions.
Thanks a lot. Maybe Tefta can also send the link in the chat. In the meantime, we have Radu Magdin with us. Welcome, and great that you joined right on time, the moment I had finished my introduction and I had given the floor to Gustav, so you haven't missed anything. Maybe the question that I asked Gustav, and I would still ask you, is how come we talk about the Black Sea in security terms only? Why is it the zone of risk? And what is your, from a Bucharest point of view, what is that creates that risk also in terms of the European kind of security perspective?
Hello, everyone. Apologies for a few tiny minutes delay. It's an honor to be today, and congrats. Thank you so much, Vessela, for the introduction, and congratulations, Gustav, for the paper. Essentially, I would say as a Romanian that we've been advocates of a Black Sea strategy, not a Black Sea synergy or a Black Sea talk in general for ages. I remember my days in Brussels starting 2007, immediately after the accession, when there were even debates about the best way forward as regards the region, particularly after a new status back then as regards Romania and Bulgaria as new members of the EU, already for a few years back then members of NATO. I think what we're faced with right now at the Black Sea is and I say this as a strategic communications professional, less of, let's say, security and military professional, and more as somebody who watches closely a process and policy and strategic communications around the Black Sea. I would say we're faced with dilemmas as regards attention management. To put it even more simply, I would say the world has enough on its plate at the global, regional, and national level. And the challenge for people and countries, institutions and countries in our region is to make sure that the Black Sea remains relevant. Of course, we can always rely on our bigger neighbor, the elephant in the room, or should I say the bear in the room, for periodically bringing attention to the region, simply because, of course, Russia is very active in the region, including at the Black Sea. Of course, Crimea was a game changer, including for NATO. But I would say more widely, the challenge remains, particularly in COVID times and nowadays. I think the energy crisis brought Russia again on the menu in terms of energy security. But again, more widely, our challenge is attention management and how do we focus on what's happening on substance and the Black Sea. And I think Gustav was very clear and very precise in pointing the challenges and the buildup in Crimea, and not only. And at the same time, your question, Vessela, was why can't we talk, for example, more economics? Simply because if you look at, if I were to simplify a circle around the Black Sea, different countries and different stakeholders around the Black Sea have different interests and are at a different moment in time in the history or are affiliated to different organizations. You have Romania and Bulgaria on one side. You have an assertive, strong Turkey, which has its own interests and plays different games depending on its national interests. You have Russia, you have countries in the Caucasus who have still, let's say, an open language as regards the EU and possibly NATO in the case of Georgia, but for the rest are realistic as regards, the current status in EU or NATO Caucasus relations. You have the so-called Eastern Partnership Plus countries, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, is the countries who are the most interested in going forward as regards the EU and or NATO. You have EU members, NATO members, Romania, Bulgaria, and you have Turkey. So you have a diversity of players around the Black Sea. Could economics work? In principle, yes. I'm young enough and old enough to be both enthusiastic, energetic, and at the same time realistic. When I say realistic, I say having an institutional memory. When I started my career in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Romania in 2004, 2005, I remember different formats of regional cooperation. And that was better times in EU-Russia relations or in regional and Russian relations, right? 2004, 2005, and so on, way beyond Crimea, right? And even before magic moments like Putin singing Blueberry Hill to a Western audience, who was having vivid applause. So even back then, we were talking about projects, for example, such as a highway around the Black Sea. Projects would never materialize. I think logistics is key. Logistics is sometimes challenging, even for us, Romania and Bulgaria, as regards TEN-T and what we're doing in the region. We have different alternatives and different plans and different formats, right? Sometimes we see Ukraine or Turkey or other countries in the region part of Belt and Road projects, or or alternatives on the 3 Cs projects. We have different alternatives as regards energy security. What I can tell you as a Romanian analyst, not necessarily expressing the Romanian state view on this, is that for sure, EU and NATO members, Romania, dare say also Bulgaria, are very interested in seeing this region stable, prosperous, and peaceful. I think this is also ideal for almost all the neighborhoods because we have, again, enough on our plate. Now, what the Russians are doing in Crimea is their agenda is strategic, and we're going to see a continuous buildup. How do we react to this as a club? It also depends on our energy management. I think that countries in the region, particularly Romania and Bulgaria, will be advocates of more attention and more efforts by the EU and by NATO as regards this issue back here, because it matters. We can't really have a stable neighborhood in case we see an increased military buildup by Russia in Crimea. And this is not an issue just for Ukraine, for common sense reasons. It's more widely an issue of concern more widely at the Black Sea. So I would say this is happening on substance. I would like to congratulate once again, Gustav, for pointing out all the elements which are on substance happening in the region. From a strategic communications perspective, I would say that the Russians are unfortunately living a golden autumn and possibly a golden winter. Because a year ago, I say this as not only a strategic communications professional, but also a risk management. A year ago, we were talking about an economic crisis after COVID sanitary crisis or during COVID sanitary crisis. But I think we imagined this economic crisis in a different way than the rollout that we're seeing nowadays. Nowadays, what we see in our region, but also more widely in Europe and sometimes around the globe, is rising inflation. And due to also problems linked to energy security, but also more widely to the global and regional supply chain, I think we're seeing, and it's not by chance that I said, a golden autumn and possibly a winter for Russia, because the energy situation is to their advantage. I look around the region and I see prices rising. I see a Russia who is going to have a beautiful budget. And again, they know best how to use their own budget for local or for regional, let's say, priorities. And I would dare say sometimes, and it's sometimes frustrating as a Romanian, in this global great power competition game, sometimes in our region, we have the feeling that it's like periodically dating with Russia. In our region, messaging a few years ago was pretty simple. The Americans was in principle our main allies and the ones who are supposed to help us on Russia. But sometimes you see these meetings also due to the fact of China rising in terms of priorities, you get a feeling that a lot of our allies are talking to Russia or starting to talk at a more consolidated way with Russia in order, to find global solutions. But this is not always to the happiness of the Black Sea region. And that would be my comments in short. Thank you so much. And congratulations once again, Gustav.
Thanks a lot, Radu. I think two very important points in addition to Gustav's topics and what he has listed in the paper. Clearly, the energy dependency from Russia that happens through the Black Sea and is enhanced by the lack of, let's say, third-party presence, and maybe next to it, but probably even more important, the fact that none of the states around the Black Sea, and here I mean Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, would be able clearly to form some sort of a coalition around the Black Sea in military terms because of the disparity in sizes and resources. And so given that, I guess, Gustav's suggestion about an international presence of sorts, be it EU or NATO, can take care of those, what should I say, suspicions or fears, but also it could maybe resolve some of the energy issues that were just mentioned. So happy to discuss further. Gustav, I don't know whether you noticed there a couple of remarks already in the chat. If you want to tackle any of them, you're welcome to do that in any time. And in the meantime, please raise your hand or just wave at me. You can also raise your electronic hand so I can see you and give you the floor. Gustav.
So thanks a lot. So as long as they come in slow enough for me to read, I will try to cope. Just about economic cooperation, if Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, then the Black Sea is the graveyard of announcement of economic cooperations. I don't think any region has been littered with so many acronyms of different cooperation formats that are all dead by now. But that's another matter. So on the 9-dash line, I mean, sort of the Russians so far do not recognize the 9-dash line of the Chinese in the Chinese claims over the South China Sea. Also not to antagonize all the other states around the South China Sea whom they have good relations with. And the Chinese have not recognized Crimea. This is sort of the status quo. The problem is it is a bit softening as the Russian take on international maritime law is increasingly becoming Chinese. And the dispute they're having with the Ukrainians over the Sea of Azov, you see the Russians picking up more and more Chinese lines and argumentations that previously you did not hear or would sound very unfamiliar when they would come out of Moscow, because they didn't. So this was one of my predictions, is that if sort of Russia and China, this will continue. And when Russia loses its court of arbitration case in the Sea of Azov dispute, it is in the kind of same situation that the Chinese are, that their claims are not internationally recognized, that you have legal arguments based on a court decision to say no, they're not. But of course, both have the military might to do otherwise and just to continue. And so Moscow's willingness to kind of care for law and legal procedures will diminish along the lines that the Chinese interest in caring for this has already diminished. I can't promise you when sort of they will mutually, or if they will formally mutually recognize each other's claims, but the practice of grabbing these claims is visible. I mean, if just sort of Chinese-Russian cooperation is a difficult and sort of larger topic, but also interesting from the military field. And in the wake of Sabah 2021, you had also on a very limited scale, but you had Russian-Chinese military drills in the Far East, concentrating predominantly on logistical issues. But that can be, or is interpreted by some as a sign that China would, in case of a confrontation with the West in Europe, back Russia, because, you know, Sabah is exercising war against NATO. What definitely happened also this year is that also Sabah is under the aegis, so it's a huge military Russian exercise, and it's organized by the Western Military District, the Southern Military District, which is in charge of Crimea and running the Russian military in the Black Sea, also had a lot of preparatory exercises with the Western Military District in the run-up to Sabah 2021, also clearly indicating that if something happens in the Baltic area, and Sabah exercises how to conquer the Baltic countries and Eastern Poland, that's the topic of Sabah. Then the Black Sea would be at least a theater where Russia would stage diversionary actions to kind of keep the West busy or keep it guessing, or split its forces towards as many theaters as possible. Sort of this is sort of the increasingly threatening or increasingly grim military picture that is developing in the Black Sea, and of course also in the High North and in the Baltics. On energy, I mean, the energy crisis that we have now is a bit long in the making. We have already in summer an under usage, sort of Russia is sort of drilling down, boiling down, sort of diminishing its deliveries of gas to the absolute minimum that was notified in contracts. Gazprom operates a lot of storage facilities in Europe, particularly in Austria, but also in Germany. These storage facilities, very surprisingly, are not full at all now. The fact that post-pandemic the prices will increase again was something that was to be expected. And Russia, of course, wants to exercise some pressure, or at least massage our public opinion that pipelines like Nord Stream 2 are necessary. So that all falls into one. Not everything is of Russia's making, but they have definitely made their best to exploit the current crisis. And LNG at the time being is little help because the entire gas market globally is expanding quicker than you have supply, which means that LNG also is diversified across many regions, and most of it is going to Asia. But on a general notice, on a strategic level, LNG will be most beneficial to the Atlantic states. That's simply for security management of LNG shipments. In France, in Spain, if the Brits still have money left, they'll probably build some of their own. You have large LNG terminals that really have the capacity to handle large gas loads. With littoral states in the Black Sea or in the Baltic Sea, the LNG terminals are made to handle peak loads in order not to be so dependent on spot prices. This is sort of the capacity of these LNG terminals is not big enough to sort of continuously supply them with gas. It's more of a pricing tactic. So I don't think that in the Black Sea or in other or in the Baltic Sea, LNG will provide the sort of supply game changer that it might be in the Atlantic, in the UK, or in France or in Spain.
Thanks a lot. I see there is one question Svilen Spasov wanted to ask. Why don't you go ahead and then I'll read the question from the chat. There are two more. Svilen.
Okay, thank you, Gustav. I agree with Radu that it's nice after years and years and years somebody to talk about Black Sea area. Me, myself, I live in Sofia, but I originally am from Varna. It's on the Black Sea coast. And I can share the few sentences, some of the situation there. The biggest probably Russian consulate in the Black Sea, it's in Varna. It's about 100 people. And in the last 30 years, or a little bit less than 30 years, the biggest populist parties in Bulgaria were fabricated there. I'm not going to tell you the names of the people, but it's Ataka, Volia, and Vozraždane, which in general sounds very patriotic, but it's not clear about which country they are so patriotic. We talk about Russian military power in Crimea, but honestly, I think that it's a matter of fear which they create in the countries, probably not only Bulgaria, but Romania, and not only from the point of view that they politically will attack, military they will attack, which seems to me a little bit not their main goal, definitely. They have different goals with this modern political war in the new political era. But this fear, it's in many ways, it works. It works in the two countries, and for this reason, probably the militarization of probably Romanian coast and Bulgarian coast is not the main goal in some way. Probably because of this fear. Even our former prime minister said that he prefers to have yachts than military ships in the Black Sea. The question is, from my point, is, okay, how we can capitalize Europe using your paper to bring more attention to that area. And one thing is just to share some thoughts, but the other thing is what the actions could be. And okay, I agree with one of your remarks in your report. That doesn't mean that I do not agree with the others, but let's say this is to increase the communication abilities, to increase the cybersecurity abilities, because a lot of, let's say, different type of flows, they go via Romania and Bulgaria, and they go then immediately to the European Union. And that's this flow of, let's say, different information, disinformation, or even some more aggressive steps, as that happened in Bulgaria with one of the Bulgarian businessmen, very similar like Skripal story. It goes in many ways via, I'm not expert in that area. I cannot say how they did this, but the closeness of Bulgaria and Romania to Russia via Black Sea definitely is a channel which they use it. That's one point. And the second point is how to diminish this fear. That's I don't have the answer. One answer definitely, if people will be, let's say, more well informed, or if the life is much better, then people will not be so afraid of so many Russians being in the Black Sea coast. And there are, I don't know, maybe 100,000 people already, Russians, which are living at least in the Bulgarian Black Sea coast. But again, the main question, probably, you having a distance from us may help us, and not only us, but European Union as well, how to diminish this Russian fear and how to be more effective working against this fear. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. If I may, I will add Yasmin Muhavid's question on the effects of potential destabilization, she calls it, of the balance of the region, if EU member states or the US send more military presence in the Black Sea. So I think this is the same question as svilen asked, but framed differently, which I thought was interesting. And then there is a question by Ian Bond. I was wondering, Ian, whether you want to ask it live?
Sure, I can do that.
Great to see you. Hi.
Hi. Yeah, so Gustav, thanks very much. I mean, my question was about the projected Istanbul Canal, and whether, if it's built, that basically will be an end to the limitations on non-littoral naval presence in the Black Sea. Is that an opportunity for NATO to strengthen its support to Romania and Bulgaria, and to a certain extent also Ukraine and Georgia? Or would the end of the regime of the Straits also offer opportunities to Russia in terms of, you know, freer movement of naval assets through the new canal and into the Black Sea?
Thanks a lot, Ian. Very important question. I will now give the floor to Gustav, but then I will ask Radu and also other colleagues from Romania if they also want to reply to svilen's question on the Russian influence. And maybe if we can also delve a little bit in the security sector reform in our countries. I mean, this is clearly one of the transmissions of Russian influence. But Gustav, over to you. Gustav, you need to open your microphone.
Sorry. Thanks a lot for bringing this up. I tried to scratch it a bit in the paper, but as my paper was about the military sphere, of course, I only touched it on the margins. But the problem of unfinished intelligence reform, to be polite, but also unfinished rule of law, prosecutory judicial reform, still unstable institutions, and faltering fight against corruptions are just as problematic as the military imbalance in the region, because there is a double layer threat coming from Russia. One is the military one I described, and the other is the subversive one, to act not only via business, but also via populists, via paramilitary forces you kind of support or train in Russia, via intelligence service, and the whole Gebrev case and its mystery and inconclusiveness in some cases is a point in case. You could talk endlessly about how it reveals the problematic issue of local counterintelligence structures that just didn't live up to their job. Just from the Russian point of view, they fit together and they depend on each other. The projection of military power, the induction of fear, having a military superiority to, if necessary, crush the enemy, provides you the security envelope in which you operate the other echelons. The Russians also project this into us. They think that we only resort to sanctions and other forms of warfare. They consider sanctions a measure of warfare against the Russian Federation to contain it, because the Americans are militarily superior to them. And that the Europeans, if there would be if there would not be an American backing, would immediately lift their sanctions because of the fear of military might. And if Russia would increase its military posture, the Europeans might also be more friendly because they start to fear Russia. So why these two spheres are very important, you should not forget that, we have some advocates who advocate civil society and rule of law reform, and it's all very important. And then you have the military nerds like me. In Moscow's mindset, it all fits together, and you have to be good on both fronts. You cannot ignore either the one or the other. The Istanbul Canal. I'm a bit skeptical on that, whether it really degrades the Montreux Convention or because the Montreux Convention applies to the Straits. So you have of course Istanbul, but the whole Dardanelles is longer, and it's only the last shortcut. The second thing is, as unpleasant as it is, it gives Turkey a strong position. Going against Montreux Convention would weaken the Turks at a time where I don't know if we should really weaken them vis-a-vis Moscow. Third is, I don't know if the Turks built the Istanbul canal and say, well, the Montreux Convention does not apply to this one because it's a post-Montreux building. They will probably seek to negotiate their own terms and limitations for naval presence in the Black Sea, because that looking at Turkey's foreign policy during the last 20 years, while Turkey pays a lot of lip service to NATO, in practical terms, they also want to limit especially American presence in the Black Sea, because they think it's their pond as well. And if they have to co-manage it with the Russians, they can easier find agreements than if you have all these bloody Westerners in with their rule of law and democracy stuff. So I don't think the canal would make things easier. I mean, the whole Turkey thing is, in the strategic discussion, is quite a headache, because Turkey at the one side, I'm not advocating like it's often advocated in Paris that, let's decouple from Turkey, they're neo-Ottoman, forget them anyway. That would be probably short-sighted given the dynamics of Turkish domestic politics, and Erdogan has a biological shelf life. I mean, he will not live forever, at least, and I wouldn't even bet that he will stay president for a very long time. The second thing, but the American counter conclusion is, well, the Black Sea, let's cozy up with the Turks and let them manage the Black Sea, and they will manage it well for us. Doesn't work as well, because Turkey will attach its own strings, conditionalities on them, and as they usually spring from Turkish domestic politics, they can be quite messy, especially with regard to Europe. So the problem for the Europeans and the problem for NATO as such is they need to have a military a military command structure in the Black Sea that doesn't exclude and insult the Turks, at the same time as not making themselves dependent on the Turks. If they exclude and insult the Turks, you kind of shoot into your own foot, and you limit your diplomatic limitations when you have to really counter Russian moves, because Turkey is there and it is capable. It's a matter of fact. But if you make yourself dependent on Turkey, you will have to fulfill Erdogan's demands in any crisis that he will attach to it, and he will attach demands to whatever he has and you want from him. so this is sort of the difficult water you need to navigate with regard to Ankara. Yeah, I think sort of both Paris's shunning and Washington's or some of Washington establishment advocating of Turkey both don't really catch the moment we have at the time.
Thanks. If I may maybe return to Ian, but also Robert, before turning over to Radu, because there is also a UK angle to this, right? There were UK ships, and there is clearly a role that also the UK could play, although it's not an EU member anymore. And speaking about kind of this cooperation of the two big guys across the pond, Turkey and Russia, probably for the smaller states around, having a third party is also going to be reassuring, apart from the other aspects that have been mentioned. I don't know if any of you would like to maybe give a bit of a British perspective. I know you don't like this role, but if you can do it just for the sake of the argument.
Are you asking me or Robert?
Any of you, but you unmuted yourself, so it's you then.
Okay. I mean, the transit of HMS Defender around Crimea was, I mean, clearly it was planned, but it's part of this big global deployment by our carrier strike group, even though the carrier didn't come into the Black Sea itself, for good Montreux Convention reasons, of course. But you know, we're not always going to have a ship in the region. Now, you know, I'm sure we will do that sort of thing from time to time again, but equally, I'm sure we won't want to be the only country in Europe that does that sort of thing. And it was quite noticeable that shortly before that, the Americans had sort of backed away from sending a US naval vessel into the Black Sea, and I think ended up sending, if I remember rightly, 1 or 2 US Coast Guard vessels into the region, presumably on the basis that this would be a much less provocative gesture to the Russians. We obviously didn't mind on this occasion a bit of provocation, but I can't imagine that, you know, we will want to be the only people identified as sailing into the Black Sea, thumbing our noses at the Russians and then sailing out again. So, you know, I'm sure we will be looking for other NATO countries to step up as well.
Thanks a lot. I don't know, Robert, if you want to add anything, maybe also on the European role and the suggestion that Gustav is making. No. Okay. Then I will ask Radu and any other colleague from Romania if you want to take the floor. I think there are two big issues. One was the one on security sector reform and the and how the intelligence community can be basically insulated from Russian influence. And second, what is the balance that you see in military terms?
In short, I'm not sure what the other means in the call. I'm very happy to give them a voice. In short, I'm very happy as a Romanian to, from this perspective, provide strategic clarity and moral high ground on military and intelligence issues. We may be a country which has a lot of, let's say, political joys on its mind, particularly today. We just had a fallout of government. But leaving that aside, the good news is that the system is working in Romania. So if I were to say, to send a clear signal on intelligence reform, military reform, and build-up of capacities in the past few years, which is increasingly, which is on track, irrespective of what's happening in politics, I'm very happy to give Romania as an example. And I'm confident from this perspective that we, together with other partners in Bulgaria and other partners in the region, we can move forward on this. So a note of optimism from this perspective. And if I may express a personal view, but perhaps also a national view, we miss the Brits and we want to stay close despite of Brexit. And we're hoping that they're going to be increasingly present in our region, despite of, again, a global agenda and a temptation in different capitals for a so-called Asian pivot. Separate from that, what I can say is that my feeling from time to time is that although it's normal for us to make the case for a region and say that we're really key for Russia, my feeling is, this time I'm a global analyst, not a regional analyst, is that we may be underestimating the empire from this perspective, and that the empire may be striking back in different areas around the world. I say this why? Because the Black Sea remains relevant, and we're very keen to have European, American, more widely Western and global interest for the Black Sea. But I can't help noticing that Russia is involved in a global power void filling operation. I say this as somebody who's watching Sub-Sahara as well, and I see Russian operations at the private level trying to become like the bodyguards of the Sub-Sahara in different countries over there. So I think from this perspective, the Black Sea is, I would say, their pet shop, the main source of operation. As a Romanian, I can also, if I may express something which is separate from the direct question towards me, but something which is relevant for the Black Sea, I personally believe, as a Romanian analyst watching the region, that the Turks and the Russians are not as good friends. Some people in different op-eds or materials want to underline them. I think that Turkey has a very ambitious agenda. Some people may agree with that agenda. Some people may disagree with that agenda, particularly at the NATO level. You know, particularly it's when you see joint ventures on military equipment, and not only. But I do believe that the Turks and the Russians are not as good friends as some people want to make us believe. And I'm confident from this perspective on Black Sea security, because I also look at developments in Turkish-Ukrainian relations. And I think that the Russians will not necessarily be contained, the Black Sea. I think you can't really contain an empire by regional or a capital with neo-imperial ambitions, to be more precise. You can't really contain them by regional resources as such as we have them right now, but I'm optimistic as regards what will happen at the Black Sea. As regards the issue of the Straits, we don't really have a debate in Bucharest at the level of the intelligentsia as regards any possible changes on the Montreux. And personally, I'm not an expert on the subject, so I'll refrain from any such comments.
Thanks a lot. Gustav, do you want to wrap up just very quickly?
Well, the Brits actually provide a good wrap-up story. I mean, the problem with their engagement is that much of that is in the kind of bubble that Boris Johnson has drawn up under his Global Britain plan. And so I sometimes wonder how sustainable it is. But the principal direction of that is good. Intelligence cooperation, and trying to push, especially the Ukrainians, together with the Americans towards reform. Here and there deploying warships. I mean, the Dutch were also heavily harassed by the Russians in the Black Sea. A week after, I think, HMS Defender. It didn't caught the attention, but it was a similar incident. So they're not alone. But in Ukraine, they're also trying to modernize Ukrainian shipyards, harbor infrastructure, naval command and control, so that you can properly link up coastal surveillance with your naval assets, start to increase air to surface force coordination, etc. All this kind of stuff, this soft stuff, how to run military operations in the 21st century. Trying to help the Ukrainians to assert control of not just the immediate shore, but also the waters belonging to it. That is crucially important, and Her Majesty's government would do such a great job if they would set all these Brexit nonsense aside and try to bring some other interested European powers on board of this, to bring more money, because that's never a mistake, but also to bring more countries that have a similar strategic outlook. I touched upon the Dutch. There are others interested in that you know, that on their own are too small to kind of bring about the same initiative, but could really provide meaningful contributions to the British effort in the Black Sea. Unfortunately, given the sort of childishness level of domestic politics, that is impossible in London at the moment. But I really look forward to things getting better there, because that's basically sort of, this is all the stuff we try to advocate and try to talk all the rest of the Europeans into it. And it could make a difference. I mean, on a final note, you know, we're talking about sort of the Russian might and its empire and the military superiority by forces. That is, of course, hard to change. But I also want to emphasize that Putin is really carefully guessing his military bets. I mean, Ukraine in 2014 was an open book to read. Syria in 2015 was a very well-known theater for Russian operatives and the military intelligence. They were not pushing into unknowns. They were pushing into the knowns, and they were pushing into predictable situations. The more presence of other partners you have there, the more unpredictability the whole fuss gets. The better we become at sanitizing our own both military and political intelligence command and control structures from Russian spying and influencing, the more unpredictable everything becomes. The more, of course, Russia can't read military communication of ex-Warsaw Pact armies, but is confronted with military communication that he can't read. It might still be superior to whatever forces we have on the ground in the region, but it cannot predict the outcome of the military engagement in this manner as it did in 2014. And hence, actually, we don't have to achieve an overall balance in the Black Sea where we can really match the Russian military might. But we need to get this kind of sufficient robustness and unpredictability that the Russians just wouldn't dare trying. And that's not the too high-hanging fruit for us.
Thank you very much. I think this was a very practical also recommendation for the end of this meeting. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot for being with us. Thanks both to Gustav and Radu for their interventions and to all of you for participating. Take care. Bye.